Have you ever wondered why some people, well into their 70s, can still walk with steady steps, open a jar of jam with ease, while others begin to tremble as early as their 60s? It may seem like a small difference, but behind that gap lies something much bigger. And if you still find yourself able to do even a few of these things, then maybe, just maybe, you're part of a rare group of people, a group you yourself may not even know you belong to. Before we begin, if this video feels like it's speaking a quiet truth you've carried inside, feel free to leave a comment below. Not for the numbers, but simply so we know that you're here, that you're listening, and that you're still living some of the most precious days of your life. And now, we invite you to step into a journey that is uniquely your own. There was a morning, or perhaps many mornings just like it. The sky hadn't fully brightened yet, but outside the window, the birds were already chirping, as if answering a whisper left in the dark hours of the night before. On an old wooden table, the kettle began to hum, and those hands, the same hands that once cradled a grandchild, tended to tomato roots, flipped through the worn pages of a notebook, now reached for the kettle's handle with a steadiness you wouldn't expect. Eleanor, 74, still wakes at 5 every morning, not to accomplish anything grand, just to brew a pot of tea, turn on the old news radio, and sit down in the cushioned chair by the window, where morning light always slips gently through the lace curtain she sewed herself years ago. Some people say, "Slow down, you're old now." But Eleanor doesn't slow down because she's old. She slows down because she knows rushing is no longer necessary. Every motion, from placing the cup on the table to stepping onto the porch, is a quiet way of listening to what her body is softly trying to say. And strangely, even though nearly all her hair has turned white, she still feels whole, present, fully there, in every small movement. This morning, as she carried her tea out onto the porch, something caught her eye, and for a brief second, her heart stood still. The chair beside hers, her husband's chair, was still there, undisturbed, but now, lightly dusted with dew. He passed away last autumn, and ever since, she's never moved that chair. Not because she couldn't bear to, but because there are some empty spaces in life that don't need to be filled, only kept as part of the rhythm. She sat down, not with tears, not with sorrow, but simply placed her tea beside his chair, as if he were still there, listening to the radio beside her. And as she raised her hand, Eleanor noticed something. Her hand was still steady. The cup didn't slip. The tea didn't spill. Her wrist still knew how to hold its balance. No, she doesn't run anymore. She no longer carries baskets to the market like she did in her 40s. But she still brews tea with those same hands. She still turns on the radio, still remembers which knob controls the volume, and she still sits by that window in the morning light like part of the light itself. No one would think to call that health, but if you've ever quietly watched her, really watched, you'd understand. This is not the body of someone who has faded. This is a body that still lives fully, in each passing moment, without needing to prove a single thing. Eleanor often tells her granddaughter, "Our bodies don't grow old overnight, sweetheart. They change, slowly, ever so gently." This morning, while washing the dishes, she paused, not because she was tired, but because she couldn't remember whether she had already added sugar to her tea. It was the second time this week. She stood still for a few seconds, eyes on the cup, heart tilting slightly. Then she smiled. Not at herself, but like someone who's just noticed a small crack on a beloved old vase. And instead of fear, gently placed a hand over it as a quiet gesture of acceptance. There was a time when Eleanor could juggle 3 things at once: watching the soup on the stove, reminding her husband to take his medicine, and remembering the cat's vet appointment. Now she needs a little note, but that doesn't make her feel any lesser. "Maybe my memory isn't as sharp as it used to be," she wrote in her notebook, "but my heart still remembers the things that truly matter." At the end of her street, Mr. Marvin, her late husband's old friend, still takes his walks every afternoon. Lately, he's been pausing more often in front of Eleanor's gate, just to exchange a few kind words. One day he said, "These days, my legs feel slower. I can't climb hills the way I used to." Eleanor simply smiled. "Slower is fine. The slower we go, the more we notice what we used to miss." Once she sat on the porch, watching the sunlight dance across the tiled floor. She noticed a slight tremble in her hands as she lifted her teacup. A soft tremble, like a breeze brushing the trees, subtle, but enough to let her know. Her body was whispering something, and strangely that didn't frighten her. If anything, it made her feel alive, truly alive within this very body. One time, her daughter came to visit and was surprised to see labels on all the cabinet drawers. "Mom, do you need help?" Eleanor shook her head. "I remember where everything is. I just don't want to keep calling you to ask. This way, I can still do it myself." A small change, but filled with quiet dignity. And in that moment, her daughter felt something swell in her chest. Not because her mother had grown weaker, but because she had found a way to remain herself. Silently, gracefully. For the young, change often feels like something to avoid. But for someone who has lived long enough, like Eleanor, every small change is a signal. Like the first breeze of the season stirring the garden out back. Not loud, not announced. Just a gentle rustle through the leaves. A soft reminder that time is passing through. But we are not being left behind. It was Saturday morning and Eleanor woke up later than usual. Not because she was tired, but because the night before, she had stayed up until nearly 11, just to finish the last stitch on a tablecloth she had promised to send to Emily, her granddaughter who had just moved away to college in the big city. Her hands weren't as quick as they used to be. The needle trembled in her grip. More than once, she thought of giving up, but Eleanor kept her head bowed under the soft light of the desk lamp. Each stitch whispered something unspoken. "I can't walk the whole road with you, but a part of me will always go with you." That morning, when her daughter came into the kitchen, she found Eleanor preparing breakfast as she always did, one hand slicing the bread, the other setting a pot of water to boil. She blinked in surprise. "Mom, let me do it. You always end up scalding your hand with that pot." Eleanor looked at her daughter, then simply smiled. "I can still do it. I just need to go a little slower." Not out of stubbornness, but because she understood, as long as we can still do something for ourselves, no matter how small, that's when we are still wholly ourselves. At her age, many had already allowed others to do everything for them. But Eleanor still chose to boil her own tea each morning, fold her own blanket, wipe down the table, turn on the radio right in time for the old news hour. Not to prove anything, but because those small acts were her quiet way of preserving dignity without ever needing to say it aloud. One rainy afternoon, she stepped onto the porch to gather the laundry. Her husband's handkerchief, the one he used to tuck into his shirt pocket, had fallen to the damp step, carried by the wind. Eleanor bent down to pick it up, but her knee wobbled, her leg ached a little. Her young grandson ran out and quickly reached down to help. "Let me get that for you, Grandma." She gently placed a hand on his shoulder and shook her head. "Grandma can do it, sweetheart. I just need to bend a little slower." And she did, slowly, but without holding on to anything. And when she stood upright again, her hand still held the handkerchief firmly, as if holding on to something far deeper. Not an object, but a piece of memory in the quiet pride of someone still living gently with herself. Some say, the older you get, the more you should let others do things for you. But Eleanor knew, helping isn't the same as taking away a person's chance to still be who they are. Like a shaky stitch in a piece of embroidery, or brewing a pot of tea even if the water spills on the counter. Those things that seem small, they might just be the last things left to hold on to in a world that's changing too quickly. That afternoon, Eleanor walked into the bedroom looking for an old notebook. She couldn't quite remember where she had left it, but she did remember the cover, ocean blue trimmed in the silver thread with a few handwritten lines by Harold, her late husband, on the very first page. As she pulled open the bottom drawer, something else fell out. Not the notebook, but a brick red shirt, round collar, lightly wrinkled fabric, the shirt Harold used to wear every weekend, while tending the garden or sitting on the porch, slowly flipping through the paper. Eleanor paused. She sat down on the edge of the bed, holding the shirt in her hands, her thin fingers gently threading through the slightly loosened buttons. The shirt still carried the faint scent of old soap, mingled now with a bit of dust from time, and in that moment, the emptiness left by his passing was no longer a sharp pain, but a soft, quiet light that seemed to radiate from the folds of that wrinkled collar. There are some wounds that don't need names. They simply remain, silent, but always know how to return when we least expect them. Eleanor didn't cry. She simply laid the shirt in her lap, like someone cradling something sacred. Not for its worth, but because it once held the soul of someone she had loved deeply. On the old vanity, there was still a wooden comb. Harold had used that comb every morning, even when his hair had grown thin. She had once thought of putting it away, but couldn't bring herself to, because there are things we barely notice while they're here. Only when they're gone do they become symbols of something far deeper, presence, in the quiet grace of fading away. That afternoon, Eleanor didn't find the notebook, but she found something else, that she was still slow enough to touch the past without breaking it, and still strong enough not to fear it when it returned in the form of a folded shirt. She placed the shirt inside a small wooden box, lined with silk, and gently closed the lid. Not to hide it, but to keep it, as a way of caring for something that had once been part of her very body. Later, when her granddaughter Emily came to visit, she asked, "Grandma, why do you keep all these old things? That shirt, those wooden combs, no one uses them anymore." Eleanor just smiled. "Some things we don't keep to use, darling. We keep them to remember that once someone lived beside us, every single day. Not all symbols live in paintings or stone statues. Sometimes they're just an old shirt, a wooden comb, a row of worn-out buttons. But to Eleanor, and perhaps to you as well, they are not just objects. They are the light that still lingers from a life that once loved with great depth. There are autumn afternoons when the sunlight slants across the yard as if it doesn't want to touch the ground. It just hovers, suspended in the air, casting its light on nothing in particular, and then quietly fades. This afternoon, Eleanor sat alone on the porch. No knitting, no embroidery, no reading. Just sitting. Her eyes looked out into the distance, though they weren't really focused on anything. One hand rested gently on the armrest, still warm from the sun. And in that stillness, in that quiet doing of nothing at all, she was living fully, with herself. There's a small bird that often visits her porch in the late afternoons. Not rare, just a little brown sparrow, white-bellied with pale gray feathers, in a song that never quite finds its note. But today, Eleanor noticed something. Though its song was faint, it was enough to let her know. The day was still continuing. There are things we never notice until we allow ourselves to be still. Along the fence, the rosemary bush is still green. Eleanor planted it years ago when her granddaughter was still a child, just because the little girl liked the smell. Now the girl has grown and moved far away, but the rosemary remains. Eleanor reached out, gently brushed the leaves with her fingers, then pressed them between her thumb and forefinger. The scent was still as rich as ever. No one told her to do that. No one was there to witness it, but Eleanor knew. She had just sent a quiet signal back to life, that she could still feel, still remember, still cherish the smallest things. We live in noisy times. Everything demands speed, clarity, and meaning. But the longer she lived, the more Eleanor understood. True meaning doesn't come from grand gestures, but from the silences we're brave enough to sit with. Her daughter once asked, "Mom, don't you ever feel sad, sitting out here alone so long?" She simply replied, "As long as I can sit in stillness and not feel empty, I'm not alone, my dear." There's something beautiful about these quiet moments, because in them, Eleanor found she could still remember things she thought she had long forgotten. The way Harold used to wink playfully when sneaking cookies into the cupboard, the soft click of the teapot lid on rainy mornings, The sound of her mother's slippers as she left for the market at dawn. Back when Eleanor was just a child, none of it needed to be retold. These memories returned only in the kind of silence long enough to welcome them, when we stopped trying to do anything at all. If you're still listening now, you're invited to simply stay a little longer. No need to do anything. No need to think. Just sit and listen to the rhythm of your own breath and ask ever so gently, is there something inside me quietly coming back to life that I've never noticed before? One weekend morning, Eleanor decided to return to the park near her home, the one where she and Harold used to walk every Sunday afternoon when the whole city seemed to slow down, just to breathe. The old wooden bench where they used to sit was still there. Beneath the shade of the old maple tree, its leaves had just begun to turn gold. Time hadn't taken the bench away. Only the people who once sat there were no longer two. Eleanor stood in front of it for a long while. Back then, when she sat there, it had always felt like just a resting point, a pause in the middle of a familiar loop around the park. But today, when she finally sat down, something felt different. Not just because the space beside her was empty, but because she herself was no longer the same. When we are young, we walk to arrive. But after a long enough journey, we sit to remember. She placed her hand on the bench's surface, where the wood had worn smooth from years of sun and rain. And in that moment, this wasn't just a park, it was a memory station, where every falling leaf carried the sound of something that would never quite return. A young couple walked by. The wife pushed a stroller, while the husband adjusted the baby's little jacket. They laughed, their voices full of life. Eleanor watched them, without envy, without sorrow. She simply smiled, a kind of smile no one teaches, the kind only those who've lived long enough ever learn. They may not realize it yet, but one day this place will become the spot they return to, just to remember who they used to be. On her way home, she stopped by the little corner store. Mr. James, the 68-year-old shopkeeper, spotted her from afar and, as always, had already begun preparing her usual bag of chamomile tea. "Haven't seen you in a while. Everything all right?" he asked. She nodded. "All fine. I just wanted to take a walk, to see the city with new eyes." James chuckled. "Same street, but somehow, each time we look at it again, it's different." Eleanor didn't respond, but in her heart she knew the truth. It wasn't the street that had changed. It was her. That evening she sat in her room, looking out through the small window. The street lamp outside cast a warm halo on the brick wall. She reached for the old picture frame on the table, the wedding photo of her and Harold, gently wiped away the dust, then placed it a little closer to the bed. No tears, no sighs, just someone quietly coming home. Not to hold on, but to look back with a heart that had learned how to let go, without losing anything at all. Night fell as softly as a thin shawl being draped over one's shoulders. No announcement, no sound. Eleanor turned off the living room lights earlier than usual, not because she was tired, but simply because today felt full. Before heading to bed, she stopped by the windowsill. Her fingers gently pulled the curtain aside, just enough for the moonlight to slip through. A kind of light that doesn't glare, doesn't illuminate, only lingers, like an old friend who needs no words to know what you're feeling. She placed the kettle on the stove, not to make tea, but to hear the gentle murmur of the boil. There are sounds like water heating, wind brushing across the roof, leaves sweeping the porch, that most people overlook. But for Eleanor, they were the sounds of life continuing, even when no one bothered to name it. Later, she sat in her bedroom chair. No book, no radio, just sitting as she did every evening. Beside her on the small table was Harold's old clock, still ticking, though its minute hand had drifted slightly off track, slower than real time. Eleanor never fixed it. She believed some things become more accurate the slower they move, especially to the rhythm of the human heart. She turned her gaze to a small photo frame, a picture of the two of them on their last walk in the park. They didn't look young, but in that photo, their eyes still held an extraordinary kind of light. "We've come full circle," she whispered. uncertain if she was speaking to him or to herself. Not to return to the old place, but to realize we never truly lost anything at all. Then she leaned back into her pillow, pulled the blanket up gently, leaving a space beside her as if Harold were still lying there. No farewells, no grand words, just a long, quiet breath, as if surrendering into a silence too deep to measure. Outside, the wind stirred the branches. A single leaf fell to the ground, unnoticed, but if someone were listening closely enough, they might have heard it land, softly, like the final presence of a life well lived. Not loud, not demanding, just a warm trace, left behind in a world that never stops rushing. And so it ends. Not a conclusion, but a pause for those still here to sit down, look out the window, and gently ask themselves, what part of me is still alive, even though I thought it had grown old and disappeared? If you're still here quietly listening this far, you don't need to comment. You don't need to share. Just give yourself a moment to breathe a little slower, because sometimes a single mindful breath is all it takes to remember you are still here, whole and quietly radiant in the middle of this life. A life message to you who have already walked a long and meaningful road. Perhaps your hands have slowed and your memory no longer shines as sharply as it once did. But please never forget, every line on your face is a record of love you've given. Every step, no matter how slow, carries a living history that no one else could ever replace. Growing older is not a step back. It is the moment we are finally allowed to live more slowly, so we can feel more deeply, to quietly listen to ourselves and see clearly who is truly still beside us. Even as the world rushes on without pause, please know this: you are still deeply needed, you are still being heard, and you are still an irreplaceable part of this circle of life.